Alabama. A black woman named Reese Taylor walked home from a church revival. A car full of white men kidnapped her off the street, drove her to the woods, and they gang raped her at gunpoint. Then they dropped her off in the middle of town, and they told her if she told anyone what happened, they would kill her. It was a pretty credible threat in Alabama in 1944. But that night she told her husband, her father, and the sheriff the details of this brutal assault. Every chapter of the NAACP called to say they were sending their very best detective. Her name was Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks went to Abbeville with a pen and a notepad, and she took Taylor's testimony. And then she carried Taylor's testimony back to Montgomery, where she and the city's most militant activists organized the Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Reese Taylor. It was perhaps the first Say Her Name campaign. They launched a national protest movement that the Chicago Defender, the largest black newspaper in the nation, called, quote, the strongest campaign for equal justice to be seen in a decade. 11 years later, this group of homegrown activists would become better known as the Montgomery Improvement Association, vaunting its first president, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to international prominence and launching a movement, the bus boycott, that would ultimately help to change the world. But when this little coalition first took root, Dr. King wasn't there. He was just in high school. And so the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott, often heralded as the opening campaign of the civil rights movement, was, I think, in many ways, one of the last acts of a decades-long struggle to protect black women like Reese Taylor from sexualized violence and rape. The kidnapping and rape of Reese Taylor was hardly unusual in the segregated South. From slavery through the better part of the 20th century, white men abducted and assaulted black women with alarming regularity and all too often with impunity. They lured black women away from home with promises of steady work or better wages. They attacked them on the job. They abducted them at gunpoint, usually from wherever they were going, whether they were walking home or back from work. They sexually humiliated and assailed them on buses and streetcars and in other public spaces. And this was the pattern throughout the South in the 1940s and the 1950s. And I think it really underscored the limits of Southern justice. But this is the thing. Black women didn't always keep their story secret. In fact, from the slave narratives of Harriet Jacobs to Ida B. Wells to Fannie Lou Hamer's stark testimony in 1963 of a forced hysterectomy and a sexualized beating, black women reclaimed their humanity by organizing public protests and testifying about their assaults. And it's those testimonies that would lead to larger campaigns for civil and human rights. In fact, even the most oft-told stories, the stories that you probably know, like the Montgomery bus boycott, the Selma campaign, or the 1964 Freedom Summer, they frequently have an unexamined history of gendered political appeals to protect black women from sexual and racial violence. And so what I do in my book is talk about how rape and resistance to rape actually sits at the center of the modern civil rights struggle. Let's talk about that a little bit. In most textbooks, the civil rights movement begins with the Brown decision of 1954, or very easily the Montgomery bus boycott. I know there's a lot of smart people in this room, so I'm going to ask you a question. According to popular history, who and what caused the bus boycott? There's a brave soul who's going to answer this question. Who caused it? Rosa Parks. And what was it about Miss Parks that day that made her not want to give up her seat, according to popular history? She was tired. She had tired feet. She was apolitical. She had this emotional response. Are we really expected to believe that a black woman's foot fatigue brought down the cradle of the Confederacy? I don't think so. Well, when asked the same question, Joe Asbell, who was the city editor of the Montgomery Advertiser, which was the white newspaper in Montgomery at the time, he talked about somebody totally different. He talked about a woman named Gertrude Perkins, and this is what he had to say.
Gertrude Perkins is not even mentioned in the history books, but she had as much to do with the bus boycott and its creation as anyone on earth.
Gertrude Perkins loomed large enough in Joe Asbell's memory for him to think about her 40 years after the event when he was interviewed for this story that I heard on NPR one day. And if your response was anything like mine when I first heard this, you're thinking, well, who's Gertrude Perkins? Gertrude Perkins was a 25-year-old black woman who was abducted and raped by two white Montgomery police officers on March 27, 1949. I'll let Reverend Solomon Say Sr., outspoken minister in Montgomery at the time, explain what happened that night.
Two policemen had picked her up and taken her down on the railroad and had all types of sex relations with her at that particular time. And when they put her out, she came to my door and she told me what had happened to her. I sat down and wrote what she said had happened to her, word by word. And when she had finished, I had it notarized and sent it to Drew Pearson in Washington. And Drew Pearson went to the air with it. And when the power structure knew anything here in Montgomery, what Gertrude Perkins said happened to her was all over the nation.
And this is pretty incredible. It goes on national radio. And after Gertrude Perkins told Reverend Say what happened, they went down to the police station and they reported the crime to the police, perhaps even the same men who had done this. The mayor called her claim, quote, completely false, and he refused to issue a lineup or any kind of warrants. Besides, he said, my policeman wouldn't do a thing like that. But African Americans in Montgomery knew better. The police force there had a reputation for not just racist violence, but for sexist brutality as well. In 1946, for example, police officers abducted and raped the 16-year-old daughter of a black woman who had challenged a police officer on a bus one day. E.D. Nixon, Reverend Say, and other black activists protested this attack and tried to keep it in the public eye. For example, Reverend Vernon Johns, who was the minister of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church before Dr. King took over, posted, and I quote, "When the rapist is white," on the church marquee. So when Gertrude Perkins was attacked by the police again in 1949, black leaders quickly mobilized. NAACP activists, labor leaders, and ministers formed an umbrella organization called the Citizens Committee for Gertrude Perkins and demanded an investigation and a trial. Their public protest lasted for over 2 months. In the process, they exposed the long-standing practice of white police officers sexually assaulting and racially attacking black women. They forced a grand jury hearing, and they brought the city's disparate black ministers together really for the first time. And this was really important because 2 years later, black activists in Montgomery rallied to defend another victim of interracial sexual violence. In February of 1951, a white grocery store owner named Sam Green raped a black teenager named Flossie Hardman. Green employed her as a babysitter, and I saw these stories all the time, babysitters, and he would often drive her home at the end of her shift. Well, one night, Green pulled to the quiet side of a road and assaulted her. Hardman told her parents about the attack, and they decided to press charges, but when an all-white jury returned a not guilty verdict after deliberating for a full 5 minutes, the family reached out to community activists. Basically, the same folks who had already been fighting for Recy Taylor and Gertrude Perkins. And together, they decided to launch a boycott of Green's grocery store. After only a few weeks, African Americans delivered their own guilty verdict by driving Green into the red. They shut him down. The ability to close Green's grocery store through an economic boycott was a major victory, and it established the boycott as a really powerful weapon for justice, something that I think we've seen recently in Missouri. A couple years later, Joanne Robinson, the leader of the Militant Women's Political Council, threatened a mass boycott of the city's buses after scores of Black women complained of sexual harassment and racial violence on them. Because really, besides police officers, few were as guilty of these crimes against Black women as were the city's bus operators, who bullied and brutalized Black people daily. What was worse is that bus drivers had police power. They carried blackjacks and guns, and they assaulted and even killed African Americans who refused to abide by the racial order of Jim Crow. In 1953 alone, African Americans filed over 30 complaints of injustice on the buses. Most of these complaints, interestingly, came from working class Black women, domestics, who had no choice but to take the bus from the Black side of town to the white side of town, where they worked in white women's kitchens. They filed all kinds of complaints. They said that bus drivers hurled nasty, sexualized insults at them, that they touched them inappropriately, and physically abused them. One woman remembered bus drivers sexually harassing her as she waited on the corner. The bus was up high, she said, and the street was down low. They'd drive up and expose themselves to me while I was just standing there. It scared me to death, she said. Another remembered that bus drivers treated Black women, quote, just as rough as can be, like we're some kind of animal. Another woman said bus drivers like to talk under folks' clothes. Women walked, Rosa Parks said in 1956, not in support of her, but because she said, I wasn't the only person who had been mistreated and humiliated. Other women, she said, had gone through similarly shameful experiences, most worse than mine. It was these experiences that propelled African American women into every conceivable aspect of the bus boycott, so that Black women were the chief strategists and negotiators of the boycott, and they ran its day-to-day operation. They helped staff the elaborate carpool system that allowed people to get where they needed to go without the buses. They raised most of the local money for the movement, and they filled the majority of the pews at the weekly mass meetings where they testified publicly about physical and sexual abuse. And of course, because they made up nearly 80% of Montgomery City Line's ridership, they walked. They walked hundreds of miles to protest their humiliation, and in the process, I believe, they reclaimed their bodies and demanded the right to be treated with dignity and respect. And so while the bus boycott is often portrayed as a kind of spontaneous movement, or a primarily male-led or king-led movement, the bus boycott had a past. It was rooted in the struggle to protect and defend Black womanhood from racial and sexual violence, and it's impossible to understand and situate the bus boycott in its proper historical context without understanding the stories and saying the names of Recy Taylor and Gertrude Perkins and Flossie Hardman and so many others who were mistreated in Montgomery. In fact, without this history, I think, it's impossible to understand why thousands of working-class Black women and hundreds of middle-class Black women put their bodies on the line to protest the buses. And Montgomery wasn't the only place where attacks on Black women fueled protests against white supremacy. We see this in civil rights campaigns in Little Rock, Arkansas, where Daisy Bates, the heroine of the Little Rock school desegregation movement, argued that the rape and murder of her mother fueled her interest in justice. In fact, throughout the 1940s and the 1950s, she used her newspaper as a kind of bullhorn to expose and publicly shame white men who assaulted Black women, and used those stories to help launch protests to bring them to justice. Or Albany, Georgia in 1962, where local people organized to defend black women at Albany State College from white men who would break into their dorms at night and try to assault them. Those students went on to help lead the Albany movement, which became known as a singing movement. Or Mississippi during the 1964 Freedom Summer, where black women who were arrested and beaten were often sexually abused when they were sent to prison. All of these major campaigns had roots in organized resistance to defend black womanhood. And yet, I think analyses of rape or sexual violence play really almost no role in most histories of the civil rights movement, even as stories of violence against black men and white men like Emmett Till or Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney provide really gripping examples of racist brutality. But I think if we're going to understand the history of the black freedom struggle, we must understand black women's stories and their history. And this is a long history. The sexual exploitation of black women stretches back to slavery, where slave owners stolen access to bondswomen's bodies strengthened their political, their social, and their economic power for two very simple reasons. One is that colonial laws made the children of slave women the property of their masters, giving white men a financial incentive to rape or sexually exploit their slaves. And two, colonial laws banned interracial marriage, but not sex or childbirth out of wedlock, which gave white men exclusive sexual access to all women while denying black women in particular the respectability and the rights granted by a legal relationship, particularly inheritance rights. These laws would create a system that would allow white men to police white women's sexual and marital choices and sexually abuse black women with impunity, both of which allowed them to be on top of this racial and economic hierarchy. After slavery fell, unfortunately, these practices remained. For example, during Reconstruction, former slaveholders and their sympathizers used violence to reassert power and control over freed people. And this is when I think rape becomes a weapon of terror, and interracial rape becomes the battleground upon which black men and women fought for ownership and control of their lives. And even though black women were the primary victims of interracial rape at this time, the idea of interracial rape was deployed by whites as a justification for lynching black men. Because in order to maintain power, whites created this myth of the black beast rapist, portraying them as a kind of incubus, a creature that attacked women when they were most vulnerable. And they used the myth of the incubus whenever they feared losing power. For example, white Democrats in North Carolina played on whites' fear of the incubus in 1900 to regain political control after a biracial fusion party took every single statewide seat in North Carolina in 1896. And this political tactic continued throughout the 20th century. In the 1940s, African Americans used to joke that the closer a black man got to a ballot box, the more he looked like a rapist. And we see this especially after the Supreme Court issued the 1954 decision outlawing segregation in public schools. Because for most segregationists, integration always and only meant miscegenation. Or as Mississippi judge and one of the founders of the White Citizens Council put it, Tom Brady, amalgamation. Headlines in the Citizens Council's newspapers. Now, the Citizens Council, some of you probably know, is sort of like an uptown Ku Klux Klan. It's like the country club Klan, where the city's leaders would meet. And they were often sort of economic terrorists as opposed to violent terrorists, the way the Klan was. But headlines in their newspaper warned whites that integration meant the incubus was coming. And so you saw headlines that said things like mixed marriage, sex orgies, and accounts of black men raping white girls were, and I quote from their newspaper, typical of stories filtering back from areas where racial integration is proceeding. Here's a Citizens Council leader actually espousing these ideas in a speech.
Don't you ever give up that gun. That's all you got left to protect that little baby in that crib. Because these dirty devils will be in your home. That's what they want. They do not want equality. You know they don't want equality. They don't want something like you got. They want what you got, your women.
Because segregationists employed these sexual scare tactics to oppose Brown and to cultivate white fear and resentment toward integration, any kind of gender or racial impropriety on the part of African Americans could be viewed as threatening the social order. That's why African Americans in Montgomery chose the very respectable Rosa Parks as a symbol of the movement instead of many of the other black women who could have very easily filled that role. And it's why I think they downplayed her militancy and her history of anti-rape activism. But I also think it's our fault as historians and people who teach the movement, because it's our focus on respectability and dissemblance that have ignored what black women had been testifying about for so long. As a result, I think we've missed some really important milestones in the civil rights movement and some really important lessons that we can use today. For example, the arrest, trial, and conviction of 4 white men for raping Betty Jean Owens, a black college student in Tallahassee, Florida, in the spring of 1959 was a watershed event. Owens' testimony in front of an all-white courtroom and jury focused national attention on the sexual exploitation of black women at the hands of white men. And when this all-white jury handed down a life sentence, it not only broke with Southern tradition, but fractured the philosophical and political foundations of white supremacy by challenging the legal relationship between sexual domination and racial inequality. For perhaps the first time since Reconstruction, Southern blacks could imagine state power being deployed in defense of their manhood and womanhood. Betty Jean Owens' grandmother recognized the importance of guilty verdicts. She said, "I've lived to see the day where white men would really be brought to trial for what they did." And I should say it was the first time in all of the cases that I studied in the South where there was actually a life sentence and that the men who were charged didn't actually serve life sentences. And never, not once, was a white man sentenced to death for raping a black woman, even though it was a capital crime in every single Southern state. And even though black men, of course, could be sentenced to death and killed for looking at a white woman the wrong way. But nonetheless, this was a big case. The Tallahassee case led to convictions elsewhere that year, in Montgomery, Alabama, in Raleigh, North Carolina, and in Burton, South Carolina, where a white Marine received the death penalty for raping a black woman before he appealed and then he was acquitted. In each case, though, white supremacy faltered in the face of courageous black women who testified on their own behalf. John McCrae, who was the editor of the South Carolina Lighthouse and Informer, a black newspaper, wondered if these convictions pointed to a new day. This forced intimacy, he said, goes back to the days of slavery, when our women were the chattel property of white men. Are we now witnessing the arrival of our women, he asked? Are they at long last gaining the emancipation they've needed? John McCrae recognized that freedom was meaningless without ownership and control of your own body. Desegregation and equality meant little if you could not walk down the street unmolested. As Ella Baker put it in 1960 after the college sit-ins, the freedom struggle was about more than access to public accommodations. It was, she said, bigger than a hamburger. A 1965 case in Hattiesburg, Mississippi was another milestone that I think historians kind of missed. Some background. In the months before SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee sent black and white volunteers streaming into Mississippi during the 1964 Freedom Summer. Segregationists in that state armed themselves for what they called a sexual invasion. They prepared to meet what they called the army of amalgamation with violence, if necessary. And you can see this picture of the mayor of Jackson with his new armaments to prevent black and white mingling. But if they were really worried about illicit integration, they should have focused their wrath on the white men who had been attacking black women in Mississippi for a long, long time. Here's a clip of Indisha Ida Mae Holland, who testifies about black women and girls' special vulnerability in the Magnolia State.
I went to babysit for this white family, and the white woman called me upstairs. I went on upstairs in a hurry so as not to keep the white woman waiting. She said, "Mr. Lawrence wants to see you." And I looked in the bed. Mr. Lawrence was laying there among the bedclothes. They were so silky. And I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. Lawrence, what you want with me?" And he immediately pulled me down into the bed and had intercourse with me. I was 11 years old that day. It was my birthday. It was no reason for us to run and tell our mother or our father because they couldn't do anything about it, but get killed if they said something about it. So many times, we girls would talk in the bathroom about it. You know, never telling our parents, but it happened very, very frequent.
The tenuousness of black life in Mississippi left more than physical scars. It also left deep psychological wounds.
I had all kind of fantasies about, I was fascinated by people like David and Goliath stories. These were my favorite biblical characters, the cats who kicked folks' butt. You know, I liked Moses drowning everybody in the Red Sea. I used to go in the woods. I used to go in the backwoods and preach and scream, fight them, run into bushes, and hit trees, and pretend they was white folk.
So you learn how to negotiate your life with white folks, and I guess you also learn the fear associated with them of how much power they actually held over you, how they could determine whether you continue to live or whether you died.
I've always found it fascinating, incredible really, that so many black women still refuse to remain silent. And after more than 2 decades of black women's testimony in Mississippi and community efforts to protect them from this kind of violence, an all-white jury finally sentenced Norman Cannon, a 19-year-old white man, to life in prison for raping a black teenager in 1965. Major newspapers hailed the conviction as unprecedented and a sign that even Mississippi was finally making serious changes. And I'll say as a side note that Norman Cannon actually stayed in prison for a long, long time. He appealed in 2000, and his appeal was denied, just going to show how recent this history really is, that this is not an ancient past, but a past that is still very much alive. Like the Montgomery movement in 1965, the Selma campaign has an important sort of prehistory of sex and sexualized violence that historians have not fully explored. Now, the 1964 Civil Rights Act left segregationists reeling. They were really on the defensive. In Selma, Alabama, the staunchest supporters of segregation and white supremacy started to use the fear of interracial sex and the rhetoric of rape to resuscitate and to revive Jim Crow there. And they used a kind of sexual McCarthyism to discredit the voting rights movement and to defame demonstrators who risked their lives on the Selma to Montgomery march. For example, white police and other authority figures, including William Dickinson, a state congressman, said in a series of affidavits that all mysteriously had the exact same wording and sentence structure, said that they saw SNCC leaders engaging in public sex, that volunteers camping overnight were involved in mass orgies, and that during the march, black men were constantly exposing themselves and fondling white women, none of which was true. And so civil rights activists were no longer just outside agitators or communists. Now they were sexual fiends, the incubus, intent on spreading a culture of depravity around the country. It was within this storm and because of it that the Ku Klux Klan murdered Viola Liuzzo, a white housewife from Detroit who defied gender and racial mores by embracing the black freedom struggle. Her detractors, of course, accused her of embracing black men. If we start to incorporate analyses of sex and sexual violence into well-known civil rights stories, the markers, the milestones are going to change. And while the Voting Rights Act is often seen as one of the bookends to the movement, I think one of the last legal barriers to black women's bodily integrity really fell in 1967 when the Supreme Court overturned slave-era laws prohibiting interracial marriage in the landmark Loving versus Virginia case. In fact, the ban on interracial marriage was really one of the last vestiges of slavery to fall, legal vestiges at least. But only by putting the Loving decision within the long struggle for black women's bodily integrity and freedom from both racial and sexual terror can it be properly recognized as one of these major milestones. Now, one of the questions I had when I was doing this research was, did black women have the right to defend themselves from violence with violence if necessary? And that question was answered in a way in the 1975 trial of Joanne Little. Joanne Little was a petite, 20-year-old African-American inmate in the Beaufort County Jail in Washington, North Carolina. One night in August of 1974, Clarence Olligood, the 62-year-old sheriff, entered her cell. Allegedly, he threatened Little with an ice pick, and he sexually assaulted her. Somehow, in this struggle, Joanne Little managed to get the ice pick away from him, and she stabbed him to death. And then she fled. As she prepared for a murder trial, because of course she was brought in on charges of murder, a broad coalition of supporters rallied to her defense. Folks from the National Organization of Women, a relatively new organization at the time, to the Black Panther Party, all came to her side. Like the 1944 campaign for Recy Taylor, the Free Joanne Little movement was also led primarily by African American women, including, as it turns out, Mrs. Rosa Parks, who headed up the Detroit chapter for Joanne Little. At her trial, prosecutors tried to paint her as a typical black Jezebel, a stereotype that was rooted in slavery. They suggested she actually wanted to have sex with the jailer, that she seduced him and killed him as part of an elaborate plot to escape. They never were able to explain how, however, she convinced him to bring an ice pick into the cell. But that aside, Little's attorney, on the other hand, fit her story into a much longer and more painful history. He read to the jury a passage from an African-American woman's 1902 essay talking about their special vulnerability in a system where white men could abuse them with impunity. And by reading this older passage aloud and pointing to the past, Joanne Little's attorney bore witness to the decades of abuse black women faced during slavery and Jim Crow, but also to their long-standing history of testimony. Well, the jury deliberated for just over an hour. And this was a unique jury in the South. It was half white, half black, half male, half female. And interestingly, they unanimously voted to acquit Joanne Little of murder. As the jury foreman read the verdict, Joanne Little broke into sobs at the defense table as her lawyers clustered around her. Wiping the tears away and perhaps even channeling John McCrae, who wondered in 1959 if black women had finally achieved emancipation, she said, "It feels good to be free." This cartoon in the Baltimore Afro-American hailed the verdict as a major victory. Here, Little is portrayed as a champion boxer, standing atop a bruised and battered Jim Crow. Hoisting Little's gloved fists up in the air, her attorneys proclaim victory for their champ and a triumph over Dixie racism. With stars swirling around his head, looking tired and, a little overweight in his Confederate flag shorts, old Jim Crow is, in this case at least, down for the count. It's been nearly 7 decades since Rosa Parks rode down to Abbeville, Alabama to get the facts in Recy Taylor's case. The national and international campaign that she started drew attention to the ruthless heart of the racial caste system. I met Recy Taylor in January of 2009, the same day that 1 million Americans gathered in Washington, D.C. to witness the inauguration of our country's first black president. And so we watched the inauguration together on her brother's little black and white TV in their kitchen in Abbeville. I asked her if she ever believed an African American woman would become First Lady. Not in my lifetime, she said. Growing up in the Jim Crow South, Recy Taylor knew that black women weren't even considered ladies. From slavery through the bulk of the 20th century, white people denied black women the most basic citizenship and human rights possible, especially the right to control their bodies. And so to see Michelle Obama take her place among a pantheon of distinguished American women was to bear witness to black women's centuries-long struggle for dignity and respect. Understanding that struggle, Michelle Obama told the Washington Post in 2008, quote, is a process of uncovering the shame, digging out the pride that is part of that story, so that other folks can feel comfortable about embracing the beauty and tangled nature of the history of this country. The brutal rape of Recy Taylor in 1944 and the sexual exploitation of other black women is a central part of our history that has been unacknowledged for far too long. But black women's testimonies made this history impossible to ignore. And while Recy Taylor never received justice in the nation's courts, in 2011, the Alabama State Legislature passed a resolution unanimously apologizing for the state's morally abhorrent and repugnant, in their words, failure to prosecute her case. An apology is not exactly justice, but it is an important step towards healing past wounds. Even the governor of Alabama had to say her name and to recognize her humanity. So today, when we say Black Lives Matter and we say her name to call attention to the continuing violence against women and men of color, we need to contextualize it. We need to put it in its proper history so that we can understand it and we can learn from it and we can take the lessons from the past and apply them to this moment in time. Thank you. I appreciate your time today.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Brianna Robinson. I'm a business and Black Studies major here. I really enjoyed your talk, thank you.
Thanks.
And I was wondering if you could address the case right now with, I can't pronounce his last name, Daniel Holtzclaw, the officer who's being charged with raping about a dozen black women, and his jury is all white. Just kind of talk about what that means given the context of the history.
So she asked about the Daniel Holtzclaw case. Some of you may be following this. As far as I know, this is not being covered on mainstream media, that if you want to know about what's happening in this case, you really need to follow the local reporters in Oklahoma on the ground who are posting to Twitter and to talk to the activists who are there. But it's hard to find information about it. Went to trial last week. An all-white jury was chosen, which speaks to the past and its continuing legacy in the present. Daniel Holtzclaw was a police officer who used his position of power to prey on some of the most vulnerable women in his town, and to specifically prey upon black women. And I think he did this because he knew in many ways that they didn't have the power to stop him, right? In fact, one of the victims of Danielle Holtzclaw testified, and her testimony is an act of courage and bravery. She testified that I didn't tell anyone at first because I didn't think anyone would believe a black woman. And so there's just this long history, both of silencing black women, of not believing them, of pointing to their past judgments of how they dress, an assumption that's really rooted in slavery that black women could not be raped. And so he is on trial. All of his victims were women of color. All of them were poor, it seems, and or were caught up in kind of a web of personal destruction, and so very, very vulnerable. So we await the outcome. But this story, to me, just has all of these echoes from the past. And the fact that we could have a hearing with an all-white jury still today with these issues is in some ways not shocking because it's what I study, but in other ways is really shocking, right? Like, how can this be accepted? So I think I would urge you all to follow it. You can reach it on Twitter through the hashtag Danielle Holtzclaw. But this is part of a larger context of the Say Her Name movement, which focuses on black women who are assaulted, abused, either physically or sexually, in the custody of police and under some kind of carceral control.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Fatu. I want you to talk a little bit about, I don't know if you've heard the phrase of rape culture in college campuses. And I mean, for me, the fact that it's actually referred to as a rape culture is a problem for me because culture is something that we do, we accept that we do it. The fact that we are calling rape culture is also another problem for me. But that aside, I want you to talk a little bit about as women, not just black, but as women in whole, what has college students can learn from the history of civil rights movement with women and them taking over their body of what to do with it, and basically using that as a lesson to not just report these things to administration, but also to do something as black and white women in college campuses.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I hope college students are recognizing from the last couple of weeks is that you're powerful beyond all measure. And you often don't recognize or use your power. And part of that, I think, is that you're busy. You've got things to do, places to go. But also, we don't teach people how to use their power. And our culture is one in which we minimize individual power, and we send messages that you need a leader to follow in order to have a powerful movement. The civil rights movement teaches you the opposite is true, right? That all you really need is yourself, that you can be the leader, right? So I think college students need to understand that there are alternative platforms to change than the structural foundations that are there already. Does that make sense? And we saw that last week in Missouri. But I also think that in terms of rape culture and what happens and the vulnerability that women often face when they're in college, let me just say this. When I was in college, I was assaulted. I was a graduate student, and it was a friend. It was a date rape situation. And I reported it to the police and went through that whole process. And it was very horrible, partly because the police asked me all kinds of questions about my own sexual history, which was just traumatic. But it made it very clear to me that they didn't think they could take the case anywhere because all these questions would be asked about my own history, and my history particularly with these young men. So I was a part of a student activist group on campus and had been very active in sort of protest politics there. And what we realized was that the legal system wasn't really going to work for us. The college reporting system really wasn't going to work for us. And so we needed a different kind of platform. So I went out of town one day, and all of my friends put posters up in every single women's bathroom naming my assailants. And there was a debate. Is this free speech? Or is this a violation of the alleged assailant's rights? Or is this what women need to draw attention to our inability to get justice in these cases? it was a bold move, and it was hard. But what it did was it drew a larger attention to this issue of date rape on campus, which was all too common, and from what I can see hasn't changed. And it drew a line in the sand, essentially saying that if this is what was going to happen, then we were going to say your name, and that there wouldn't be an easy escape. The long story has a really great ending, but in the short run, what we could do on campus was draw attention and use these alternative forms. Today, there's social media in a way that wasn't around when I was in college, and so I think there's more outlets for you, but the point is the same, is that there's other outlets to get your voice across, and that to use your voice as a weapon. And that's what I think the civil rights movement teaches us too.
My question was just about how do you think that the sexualization and this history of sexualization of Black women has contributed to like media representations in like modern day Black women in terms of like stripper and video vixen culture, and like how that history of assault and just sexualization being perpetuated has contributed to those perceptions that we currently have?
So, I mean, some of you probably know the answer to this question better, but I think that in some ways we haven't grappled enough with Black women's long history, and so that we just see repeating images of Black women as sexual objects and things to be used, commodified, abused at will. I think there is this long history, of course, that denies that and fights that and has protested it. And I see that continuing on lots of different levels, probably more today than I've seen in a long, long time. So I think that that's really good. But we're all guilty of falling into some of those traps of listening to music that objectifies women or mistreats them, dancing to songs that talk about, women's bodies as objects to be played with. And so I think we need to fight against that constantly. And it's a hard struggle. It's not something you can do every day. And sometimes a song is just a song, and you want to dance to it. But I think that we need to continuously, again, raise our voices to speak out against the kind of culture that continues to thingify women of color and women in general.
Over the course of history and currently, we're seeing a shift in, I guess, what we see as ideal beauty, and you touched on it briefly about basically the fetishization of Black women's bodies, and basically what I'm asking is, could you say a little bit more about the root and where the foundations for that fetishization comes from, and how do we see that playing out currently?
So I think you see, contradicting movements. So on one hand, you have this long history of fetishizing Black women's bodies. And that goes back to the colonial era, right, where you see engravings of explorers coming to the United States or having traveled to Africa or across the Atlantic world and seen the slave exchange of women's bodies, Black women's bodies, that are grotesquely out of proportion, right? Jennifer Morgan's work, for example, she's a historian at NYU. She does great work on this, and her work is really important to understanding this. And then you have, of course, the Hottentot Venus, right? And these images, and which look exactly like Kim Kardashian's picture not that long ago, right? Where everything is exaggerated and emphasized. And it's interesting because she's not a Black woman, but she's racially ambiguous. I guess she's a woman of color, sort of, in that she's Middle Eastern descent. Anyway, it's complicated. But that picture was really, I think, playing on that image of the Hottentot Venus. And so I think we're bombarded by a lot of these images. We're bombarded by images of women as sexual objects. I think we often see more women of color as being sexy, voluptuous, passionate, a fiery passion that can't be put out, which is why, of course, they can't be raped, right? But then I think there's also this movement, mostly in the Black world, of celebrating Black beauty and celebrating Black hair and natural hair and natural skin color and stuff that's actually, I think, fighting really hard against that in the cultural realm. And so in our world where we select the kinds of things we see and what we don't see, my Black women friends are always looking at the kind of, I think, as a way to protect themselves at the celebration of black beauty, right? To protect themselves from the daily assault of the images of black women on television. And you hear it all the time, if you turn on the news. I mean, just don't watch the news. Read the newspaper, turn the local cable TV off, because it's a parade of racist images all the time that's designed to make us afraid of black people and to reinforce in our minds stereotypes of black people as lazy, on welfare, involved in gangs and crime, and not deserving of their citizenship, right? Turn it off, because those ideas get in your head and then you breathe them and live them unconsciously most of the time. I don't know if I answer your question, probably not, but that's the best I can do right now.
Dr. McGuire, thanks for coming today. My question, do you think that black women today experience prejudice differently than black men, and if so, how?
Well, I think the best way to answer that is to look at the news. I mean, yes, right? Because black women have the double burden of being a woman and being black, or the triple burden if they've got any other kind of situation which makes them vulnerable or considered marginal. So yes, they experience prejudice different than black men. And black men experience prejudice different than black women. I think that that's basic. Although black men and women are united in that they experience racial prejudice because of their race, but they may experience it differently based on the situation that they're in. Black women are not as surveilled as black men in public by the police, but they are equally vulnerable when they're in police custody. And they're often seen as criminals or criminally minded, not always in the same way as black men, but often, right? And so there's a lot that they share and a lot that they don't share. Black women are vulnerable to sexual violence by men of any color and by women of any color, right? And black trans people are vulnerable in lots of different ways. So I'm not sure there's a point in trying to figure out who's more susceptible to prejudice, right? The point is to understand why that prejudice is happening, what's rooted in, and to work to end the prejudice. And I think that's rooted in white supremacy, and that's where that work comes in.
I'm a sophomore. You mentioned before that we can't really make a lot of meaningful change unless we have white people also behind this change. I've often found that in my own experience, when I try to breach the subject, people get really defensive and take it personally, like, oh, I'm not racist, is one response. The other one is like, well, slavery was like...
I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
A lot of times, like when I try to breach this topic with other white people, the two responses that are very common are, I'm not racist, and slavery was like 300 years ago. Which it very well wasn't, and I guess my question is, what do you think are some really effective strategies for educating white people on not only the reality of the situation of black Americans, but on the actions that they can take to help reduce this inequality?
That's a great question. So one time when I was organizing in college, I was working with white students, and I gave everybody a sticker that said, I'm not racist, so that they didn't have to say it. Because we all knew that they weren't racist because they were wearing their sticker. So I think one of the things to do is to try to eliminate that defensiveness from the beginning by saying, yes, we know you have good intentions and that you're not consciously racist and that you're not an active bigot, but we're all swimming in the same water of white supremacy, right? And to say that we're not wet is really ridiculous. And so I think some strategies are the stickers. I swear that really helped our discussion. But to get people to understand history, to make it less personal, right? Because it's personal in the sense that we all need to come to these conclusions on our own in our own ways, but it can't always be about the person because people have a hard time looking deep into themselves. But they can be brought there, I think, gently and over time. I think the first thing you need to do is find all the really good allies and set them off to work. And I've worked on some people for years and years and years and years. And sometimes that's what it takes, and that's okay. You're not going to get a convert right away, and you're not going to get people to say, golly, I'm a white supremacist, right? That's not going to happen right away. But what you're going to see is people slowly recognizing that the world around them looks different when they understand the context of the history in white supremacy than before they had that context. And that different view is going to help them make different decisions about how they live their everyday lives. So I think this is a long struggle. I think it's the kind of struggle that needs to be done, but that it's an everyday kind of thing. And I think for people who already get it and who are already part of the choir, they need to get to work. They need to get to work in their communities, registering voters, talking to people about the issues, making sure that they're well-informed and educated, countervailing the news arguments about Black Lives Matter and getting people to support it whatever way they can. The easy thing for white people to do is to kind of avoid the white community and try to join in with students of color because they feel more comfortable there because people agree with them. And that's okay, but you can't dismiss that work. You can't, there's no place to run to, right? You can't hide from who you are and your history and your community, even if you don't like them so much sometimes. I think that's true for anyone, really. Conversations are really good. Personal conversations are really good. Events where people can learn are really good. The times in my life when I've really recognized my whiteness and my privilege are times when I was in all Black environments, right? Where all of a sudden I became aware of my racial identity and I felt very weird and uncomfortable, and I realized, oh my gosh, the students of color at my school must feel this all the time. Or maybe they're used to it, or maybe they're not, right? The moments that have been most impactful to me are those moments. And then, of course, I think really stretching out and being in more diverse communities makes a huge difference. People learn from the people that they're around, right? So I think there's lots of little things you can do. I think there's a few big things you can do. But I think this is a long struggle, and you shouldn't write people off because they are ill-informed. And I'll just add that I think all of it needs to come from a place of love, right? And not dismissiveness or disparity, but a place of love. Anyway, that's it.
So, I'm a junior, and I'm an Africana studies major, and my question is, okay, so when I first heard that this was going to be a Common Hours talk, I thought at first that the person who was going to speak was actually going to be a Black woman, not a white woman. And so I think the question that I had, because I was slightly uncomfortable with the fact that this was being a talk held by a white woman, no offense, but I guess the question is, like, what exactly made you want to talk about this? Like, why did you choose to have this talk, and why did you choose that specific title that, a Black woman's body was never her own?
That's usually the first question I get, typically, really. What made me choose to be interested in this? Well, I should say first that, this might sound weird, but I'm a child of Black power. And what I mean by that is that Black students organizing in the 60s and the 70s fought to have Black studies taught on college campuses, right? And they helped to create one of the very first Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Wisconsin. And I went through that department. It changed my life. And so I'm a child of Black power, even though I'm sure the organizers did not intend little white girls from Wisconsin to be, majoring in that subject. But here I am. When I was in high school, I read a book. I'm from Janesville, Wisconsin, a little small town south of Madison, a former GM town that was majority white. And even though I was working class and came from a single mother, I didn't understand or know about race, right? I understood class a little bit. But I read this book in high school. My librarian gave it to me, so shout out to all the librarians. And she said, I think you'll really like this. And it was a book called Savage Inequalities by Jonathan Kozol. Some of you education folks might know it. And it just blew my mind. I couldn't believe it, and this is probably step one of, understanding racial identity. I didn't think it was true. I thought I had been lied to my whole life about equality and fairness and freedom and justice and everything America was supposed to stand for, because what this book documented was stark inequality in the public schools, something I hadn't seen because my school was all white. So I decided to do an experiment. My father lived in Milwaukee, and I thought, well, is this true in Milwaukee? Let me go and see. And I'll see if it's true, because I don't believe it, because everyone's equal. It's just so naive. So I went to the South Division High School in Milwaukee, where I was the only white student there. And I spent 2 weeks there observing. And it just blew my whole world open. And they didn't have anything that we had. They didn't have a college recruiting office. They had a military recruiting office. They had 50% attendance. They had metal detectors at the door. They had a 12-foot high fence around the teacher's parking lot. It felt like prison. And in some ways it was. The stuff they were doing in 12th grade was stuff I had done in the 8th grade. Like, we were not competing. We were not running the same race. I was way, way, way ahead. And not because of my innate, brilliance, but because, which I don't have, but because of where I was born and who I was born to, which seemed grotesquely unfair to me. So I came out of that school like, oh my God, I've got to change the world. This is wrong. And that's how I felt at that moment. And that made me want to study how we got to this place, which made me look into segregation. How is it that a school could be so segregated in 1992? Like, I thought that was ancient history, as you pointed out, right? But it wasn't. It was all here. And how is it that their education was so much less than mine, and that their extracurricular activities didn't exist compared to mine, which was like everything? How was that possible? So that led me to try to understand white supremacy, which led me to Black studies. And I got very interested in the civil rights movement. And because here was a moment in history, because I really hated history before this. Here was a moment in history where ordinary people who had almost every strike against them stood up to power and really changed the face of the nation and changed the laws and made just enormous, made America try to be what America's supposed to be, right? That really spoke to me. I liked that. And so I got interested in African American history. From there, I was really interested in the civil rights movement, and I kept coming across these stories of Black women who were assaulted and had gone to court. But there was nothing in the literature, the historical literature anyway, that talked about this. And at the time, slavery studies was a really big deal. And so there was some of that in slavery studies, but not in the civil rights movement. And I just kept trying to find women's stories and hear their voices. And I realized that that I could be a megaphone for their voices. That as a white woman, I couldn't tell their stories. They don't belong to me. But I could be a microphone to help amplify their stories so that other people could hear them, people who hadn't heard them before. Thank you so much. I hope you have a lovely day.